Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, your host today, and I'm just so excited to bring on one of the premier pipe organ players, not just around New York, where he's based, but around the world, just a spectacular musician who also knows a lot about the history of the pipe organ. We're going to talk with him about some recitals that he's got coming up and the history of just an incredible instrument. Paul Jacobs, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, Tyler.
Now, I wanted to just, before we start, a lot of people, their only concept of the pipe organ might be from walking into a church and hearing it, every Sunday or every few Sundays, depending on how often they go to church, or if at all. Can you just give people a sense of what exactly we're talking about here? It's a pretty sizable instrument with a lot of mechanics and physics behind it.
Yes. Well, the organ can be a sizable instrument. It can also be a small, intimate instrument. And the first 1,000 years or so of the organ's history, it was not in a sacred setting, but actually was used at first by the ancient Greeks in about the 3rd century BC, and it was known as the hydraulis. That is the earliest example of an organ, or at least a mechanism that used the basic principles of a pipe organ. The organ is basically it's a keyboard instrument and a wind instrument. And so you have pipes, or you think of them as large whistles, that sit on top of pressurized air, wind, and that's stored in a reservoir, and the pipes are controlled by a keyboard. So you can go back to the ancient Greeks, of course, the Romans being very practical. They made their own innovations to the instrument around the 2nd century AD, and they got rid of the sort of the water pumps and other components and just used a bellows. And you think of how you stoke a fire with the old-fashioned bellows. Well, I guess that's what the Romans, their contribution to it. And then the organ, it disappeared with the fall of the Roman Empire. At least it disappeared in the West, and knowledge of it was stored in the East, in Byzantium. And it wasn't until the 8th century AD that it was introduced into the West. And from that point on, around the 10th century, we have the first records of it being in a cathedral in the UK, specifically in Winchester Cathedral. And from that point on, it grew in a sacred setting for many centuries. But up until that point, it was used for circuses, and it was taken into battle, and it was a very festive, loud, thrilling instrument. And it still can be just that.
Oh, when it's going full bore, it is a really fun thing to hear. I wanted to ask you about that association with sacred music. How is it that the organ, again, at least in popular imagination, became so associated with being in church on a Sunday and listening to the organist?
Well, the organ was originally used in church in alternation with choirs and choral singing, and eventually it was used to accompany congregations in their singing. And it still is to this very day. But organs, I'm very supportive of the instrument in existing in both a sacred and secular setting, in concert halls as well as in churches and great cathedrals. But the organ, its ability to sustain, its ability to support singing from the deep bass pipes to the brilliant higher pitches of the instrument. It also has this sublime quality. You walk into a great cathedral and it's as uplifting to the human spirit as anything that human ears could hear.
And with that kind of sound and with that kind of power, there's also a remarkable physical challenge to actually create a pipe organ and maintain it and sustain it. Can you just give people a sense of what it takes, not only to have the pipe organ, first installed, but also to keep it going?
Yes. Well, building an organ is no small feat. And like today, if a venue wants to acquire a pipe organ, it's something that takes a few years if it's of a reasonable size, and it takes a lot of planning. I mean, organs are not, they don't come off of an assembly line. They are custom built for a particular space. They become part of the architecture. And this involves sometimes acousticians and architects themselves, as well as organ builders who have to do a lot of planning and the design. It goes without saying that pipe organs are very expensive, running in the millions usually. When you think of all the moving parts, the big pipes and small pieces and all kinds of mechanisms. So it takes time to construct these great things. And historically, they were viewed as points of pride to towns and cities throughout Europe. I mean, whoever had the bigger pipe organ, that was something to brag about. And it still is, for that matter. I mean, there are town halls. A few years ago, I was in Australia, and the town halls in Melbourne and in Sydney, they have these glorious, huge pipe organs that are used for civic occasions, and they have recitals on them and all kinds of events, and people are proud of that.
It's something actually that sort of brings up an interesting point as an organist, because a flute player or a violinist can take their instrument with them, and often will have one instrument that they're playing. As someone who's an organist, anytime you move, you are playing a different organ, and that means that you get sort of intimately familiar with some of them. I wanted to ask you, what it's like to do that, and if there are any that particularly stand out to you that you have loved to play.
Oh my. Yeah, that's a pretty tough question, just given the varying nature of these things. But it's a blessing and a curse, really, Tyler, to play an instrument that varies so dramatically from one to the next. Because on the one hand, your interpretations, it allows you to remain fresh, because if you take music that you've played 1,000 times to a new organ, that in and of itself breathes new life into your work. And you get new ideas based on the particular instrument, the sounds available. On the other hand, it can be a little disconcerting, because there are some organs that are not in the greatest condition, and you have to turn them on their ear upside down to just try to get the desired results, maybe playing things on a different keyboard or playing them up or down an octave just to find the right tones. But it's, as far as an organ that I like, there's so many of them. I mean, there are a lot of national schools historically in organ building, organ playing. French organs known for their fiery reeds, and particularly in the 19th century, and German organs with their clean principals, and English organs with their rich diapasons and tubas, and American organs. Every country seems to have contributed its own style to the art of organ building, and it's fun to play different kinds of music on each of these instruments. And it also depends on, oftentimes composers of a country, they're inspired by the style of organ within that country, and they write a certain music based on the organs that are available, rightly so.
So that's actually what I wanted to ask you next, and I had the real just privilege of spending some time in France. I've been there a few times, but on one occasion for a summer I was in Paris, and among the many places I visited just about every dead composer who was buried in Paris. But I also visited the Sainte Trinité church where Messiaen played for I think 30 years or something like that.
Right.
And I think that was also where Berlioz's funeral was held, and a few other people, if I'm not mistaken. But I wanted to ask you, you're playing Franck for this recital. So I was wondering about that French tradition of organ playing, which certainly seems, quite rich.
Yes. Oh, it's very rich. And I think the French think that they have the richest tradition of them all. And they have strong arguments to make for that. I adore French culture, French organ music, and they're very proud of it, rightly so. Franck was incredibly important in the history of French music, not just organ music, but he was an organist. And surprisingly, his output for the organ is not enormous, but it's one of quality. And he wrote 12 pieces, 12 substantial pieces for the instrument. But much of his responsibility as an organist at Sainte-Clotilde had to do with improvisation, much like Messiaen at Sainte Trinité. The French organists to this day are known for their improvisatory prowess. They improvise, and they do it brilliantly. And I think that is something that distinguishes them in the world today, is that they just absolutely love it. Not to say that there aren't brilliant improvisers in other countries, including the United States, but they like to take claim for that, and I understand.
That's something that is that a something born out of necessity, needing to, if you were an organist, needing to make sure that you had enough music to go, or was it an artistic reason for that, or maybe a little of both?
Yeah, I would say a little bit of both. I mean, practically, playing for masses, many masses, it just seemed more practical to improvise. But also, there's something deeply spiritual about being in the moment like that, being inspired, say, by religious texts that are being read, or the sermon, or whatever, the liturgy and how it's presented. And the best composers were receptive to that and connected with it and enhanced it, magnified it for the worshipers below.
I wanted to know, with the way that the organ is often situated in a sacred context, and in fact, for a lot of organ recitals, you end up sometimes by necessity, having to have them in churches. Is that something that goes into, certainly, I guess, on an artistic perspective, into your conceptualization of playing and of programming these recitals, and also into, you think, the general feeling around the organ in the artistic community?
That is absolutely a very perceptive question. It's a huge question. One could open up a can of worms in attempting to answer it. And yes, there's no doubt that the organ in an increasingly secular society, it could be to some a stigma. The fact that many pipe organs, great pipe organs, are in churches, and that is off-putting, I suppose, to those who are, let's say they don't like religion. But I would say that there are people that are not religious that still appreciate the aesthetic and artistic value of organs, and they're happy to go into a church. Many of these churches are beautiful pieces of architecture. I mean, they're very inspiring, beautiful buildings. And to go into one and hear beautiful music, I mean, everybody wins. But a few years ago at Juilliard, I asked this question. We had a panel discussion with some journalists and such, and it elicited some reaction in the Juilliard Journal, the publication. Some people wrote in, including one who I believe was a program annotator for a few orchestras, and he indicated that he found himself not wanting to go to an organ recital, not because he didn't like organ music, but because it was located in a church. And he says, I just can't bring myself to do it. Well, it was very honest, but somebody else responded. He said, you can't limit yourself this way. It's just not, you're losing out, you're missing out. And so I implore people to be more open-minded to these things. And that's apart from the religious question in general. I mean, you look at religion in the world, and maybe in the West it's declining, but in Asian countries and in Africa, it's growing. I mean, I happen myself to believe that there is a spiritual void in each human being that needs to be filled. And we can discuss how, but it's there. And I think that the organ, it's very sensitively close to that big controversial question.
You mentioned the intimacy of organs, and there was at one point a tradition of pipe organs, and perhaps people are still making them, portative organs and other smaller versions of these organs that you could actually take around. What was that? I guess, to go back a little bit in time, where does that come from, and why don't we see those smaller versions of pipe organs today as much as the larger ones?
Yes, well, the organs of all sizes and shapes, and these exist everywhere. Certainly, chamber organs, smaller instruments, self-contained. Sometimes they're called portatives, a little larger, but still on the smaller side would be called positive organs. But the portative, I think you're referring to, that is often used in Baroque chamber music. You can find that somewhat regularly. Kind of like the harpsichord, but there are limitations to it. It does certain things very well. It's meant to do certain things. But of course, the larger the organ, oftentimes the more versatile, not always, but oftentimes the more versatile the instrument is. And so I suppose that's one of the reasons you may encounter larger instruments, is you can just do more with it. But it's worth pointing out that you can still make a big monster of an organ sound very sensuous and very intimate and quiet. It can roar like a lion, but it can whisper, with the softest pianissimo, and all of these things in between can be coaxed from the many pipes of an organ under the organist's fingers and toes.
Yeah, and using a lot of people maybe haven't been behind the keyboard and all that, but you have all these things that these levers that you can pull in and out of, and a lot of them end up with various instrument names so you can have a flute or something like that. These how did these the stops develop on the pipe organ to the point where now you've got tons of them all back there?
Yes, absolutely. The stops were invented probably, one wants to say in the 14th, 15th centuries. And up until that point, the organ was almost exclusively loud. You play a key and it would control X number of pipes, but the stops were invented to literally stop certain pipes, certain rows of pipes from speaking. So you had more control over the dynamics. And it was really about the 16th century that the truly modern organ as we know it today, with its many keyboards, pedals, and stops, came into its own. And that's ultimately what we're after. I mean, you mentioned, Tyler, the gadgetry of the organ. And this is something that fascinates most people. It fascinates me. I mean, because organists have this complicated instrument, the most complicated, with all these levers and gadgets and buttons, etc. But the point needs to be the music. The point needs to be the expressive power of making music on the machine. I think sometimes organists and people who are interested in the organ, they are more interested in the machine than they are the music. And it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's one that we need to be challenged by. At least I try to challenge my students at Juilliard to think about what the prize is. Is it just a kind of a nerdy fascination with this instrument, which I have, admittedly, and I think most of us do, but the emotional, the human part of it craves much more than that. And I think that the real prize has to be the music, the repertoire that goes. For the organ, there's no other instrument with as vast, wide-spanned repertoire as the organ. I mean, it can be traced back to the Robertsbridge Codex of the mid-14th century, and it just continues in this uninterrupted stream right through our most youthful and contemporary composers today.
And that's actually another strand that I find interesting is so often when you look through composers' biographies, one of the ways in which they made their money, I mean, all the way, and including Bach, who, one of the most famous composers out there, one of the ways that they made their money is as an organist. And the organ, in many ways, sustained a lot of musical careers of composers. Has that also helped it to grow in its repertoire, since it's helped so many composers out?
Absolutely. Historically, the organ, as we've discussed, is the important composers from the Renaissance on, who were virtuosos themselves. Certainly Johann Sebastian Bach, some have said the greatest of all. But right down the line, whether you're talking Handel, whether Mozart, Beethoven was a court organist. People don't realize that. Haydn played the organ. And certainly in the 19th century, people like Liszt and Franck. I mean, it was just better incorporated into the fabric of music. And even through the first part of the 20th century, I mean, you have then all of a sudden, all these innovations with the organ, and the instrument as a machine grows as a creation. But then you have the organ accompanying silent films and being put in theaters. And you have organists like Edwin Lemaire transcribing all of these great symphonic works for a new style of organ and bringing these to the general public. And there was an enormous appetite for the organ. It seemed that around the mid-20th century, for all kinds of reasons, the organ began to drift in its own direction. And you have composers like Stravinsky saying the organ is the monster that never breathes, and to which I would say, well, an instrument doesn't breathe. Of course not. It has to be the musician that breathes or doesn't breathe. I mean, an organ is an inanimate object. So it's up to the musician. Maybe he had a bad experience with the instrument. But then you have people like George Sell. I grew up with listening to his recordings with the Cleveland Orchestra, benchmark. I mean, brilliant conductor, but I learned he was no friend of the organ. He had the organ sealed up in Severance Hall in Cleveland. And thankfully, Franz Welser-Most and Dochnani, prior to him, they enabled the organ in Severance Hall, the beautiful Skinner, to be heard again. And now we have concert hall organs around the United States. Virtually all the concert hall organs have pipe organs, except for Geffen in New York and Carnegie, which is, I would say, shameful, to be quite honest with you, especially Geffen, because they've just undergone this renovation, and that's a whole other topic, which I'm happy to discuss. But but a positive note, you have these North American, in Asia, the new concert halls being put up all have pipe organs, certainly throughout Europe. Paris has 2 concert halls with 2 pipe organs, the same with London. And so it's not like the organs, they're ubiquitous. That's the thrill. They're all there, and there are brilliant organists out there.
It is something that I've gotten a chance over at Symphony Hall in Boston, which is close to me, to see the Ives Fourth Symphony and to see the Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony. To hear the organs going full blast with the symphony orchestra and everything involved is a really spectacular thing as well. Which is I'd highly recommend anyone who gets a chance to go see something like that. But I did want to ask you, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this recital and about these pieces. You talked a little about the history of French organ playing and of Franck specifically, but I wanted to just ask, why Franck and why these pieces?
Well, Franck is one of the most profound composers for the organ. He was a true poet. I mean, not only as an organist, he came to the instrument relatively late in his career. He had his training primarily as a pianist and was a virtuoso as far as we can tell. But it seemed that the organ fitted his nature a bit more. I mean, we know that he was very devoutly religious, and the sort of the large structures that he envisioned for the organ, the precursor to his great symphony, it was written for the organ as a symphony for organ known as the Grande Pièce Symphonique. He wrote 6 pieces. This is one of the 6 in the middle of his career, and they are exquisite. Liszt referred to these 6 pieces as being on par with the music of Bach. Franck was very important because he restored respectability. He restored, I don't know if you want to say order. I mean, you think of the French Revolution, the chaos, the bloodshed. Art and culture seems to go out the window when those things prevail. And the finer things of life are put on hold, if not are destroyed by iconoclasts. But and true, organ builders, many of the pipes were burned down and turned into used for bullets and all those kinds of artillery. And it wasn't until the dust settled that the Parisians got their act together, so to speak. But still, the organ playing was not. It was kind of silly in the early part of the 19th century. It was sort of these pastiches and these thunderstorms and all these weird effects and circus music. And it was Franck who had more profound aspirations for the instrument. And we see in his compositions a richness of counterpoint, a richness of harmony, an order, a discipline, but also heartfelt expression. I mean, absolutely, goes to the soul of a person in his work. And I would say this is the appeal. You can hear this, even if you don't understand music. Even if you haven't studied music, there's something sublime about the experience of it. And then, of course, after Franck's 6 pieces, we have 3 pieces that he wrote for the Trocadero, which was a secular venue, Paris's first concert hall that had a new organ in it. And so he wrote these pieces. And at the very end of Franck's life, we have the 3 chorales, which I would say are pieces as elevated as any piece for any genre by any composer. His 3 chorales for organ. And anybody who knows much about music should absolutely have encounters with these late pieces. They were composed the last year of his life. In fact, even after Franck, who had a terrible accident in the street, he was hit by a trolley, as it were, on the streets of Paris. That eventually led to his weakening and did him in months later. But he was so determined in a dire state to complete his chorales that he managed to work his way high into the gallery at Saint-Clotilde and work on these pieces. And these were his last will and testament to the world. And they were truly a master at the height of his powers. I mean, I would say that was one thing about Franck. He was very human. He was a composer who was critical, very self-critical of his own abilities. And sometimes his critics were very critical. But my goodness, what he left to posterity. Franck, at his best, is the genius of any great composer. And it's probably underappreciated, even amongst classical music lovers. So that, I would say, is the reason, this soul that inspires me and continues to inspire us today.
That is a great introduction and hopefully advertisement for people to go down to St. Mary the Virgin in New York. It's I have here, it's on West 46th Street on March 29th or on June 7th. You will be performing these all Franck recitals, and just generally Paul Jacobs, I think we mostly have historians, so I feel pretty comfortable saying that you're the first Grammy-Award winner here on the podcast. Paul Jacobs, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, it was a pleasure to be with you, Tyler. And the only thing I would love to add is one of my favorite quotes of Michelangelo, and it refers to anything beautiful, and that includes the organ. And he said, quote, "A beautiful thing never gives so much pain as does failing to hear and see it." And I hope that hearts and ears will become open to the pipe organ, because the rewards are breathtaking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.